you happen to stumble across this video somehow, welcome. And I'm honestly pretty surprised. Must have gotten pretty lucky with the YouTube algorithm, given that this is my first video. Anyway, stick around to either enjoy my biased and dramatically oversimplified stance on US foreign policy, or stick around to laugh at my horrible Rainbow Six Siege gameplay. Either way, I'm glad you're here. So I'm sure that in some way or other, you're at least remotely aware that the United States has multiple bases established internationally in foreign countries. Maybe you've seen a movie featuring US military stationed in Italy, got an older brother who's a soldier in Germany, or maybe you yourself were stationed overseas at some point in your military career. I myself personally fall into that last category. As a young artillery marine, I found myself stationed in Camp Hansen, Okinawa. And as a fresh out of high school weeb, I couldn't have been any happier. Believe me, I enjoyed my time in Japan. From partying with the JSDF, the Japanese Self-Defense Force, spearfishing on the coral reefs of the China Sea, and making the Kintown crawl, if you know, you know, back to the barracks, I had the time of my fucking life, and I made some lifelong memories and friends. One of those memories, however, was a statement made by my battery CO during a safety brief regarding the importance of our positioning on Okinawa in the Pacific. In reference to US military bases being established internationally, he described them akin to being parts of a modern-day representation of the Roman Empire. And now, don't get me wrong, he was clearly using dramatic language to try to motivate us to stop getting drunk and doing stupid shit like force the Japanese pizza delivery guy to play beer pong with us in the barracks. That correlation between the US international positioning, though, and that of an empire, however, really stuck with me, and quite frankly, it kind of bothered me. At the time, I really couldn't put into words exactly why it bothered me. But as my interest in US foreign policy and the role the US plays in international relations has grown, I think it's become a little bit more clear to me. Now, while I would love to get into the complexities and the problematic stance of the US military being represented in bases literally in over 70 countries in the world, because as Ron Paul says it best,
there are particular areas that you specifically already know that you'd like to close the bases that we have?
Yeah, all of them.
I'd like to focus on the US military in Japan in this video, both because of my personal experiences in the subject matter, as well as its visibility as perhaps of one of the largest and well-known bases upkept by the US military in a foreign country. So let's start examining this little area by looking at the history behind the United States maintaining a military base in Japan. Following the end of World War II and the surrender of Japan, two very important documents were ratified that are key to examining the US military presence in Japan: the 1947 Constitution of Japan and the 1951 Japan-America Security Alliance. While the 1947 Constitution made a lot of changes to many key areas to its method of governing from the late 19th century Meiji Constitution, most relevant to this discussion is what's covered in Article 9, stating, "The Japanese people forever renounce war as a sovereign right of the nation, and the threats or use of force as a means of settling international disputes." Basically, Japan put into writing their complete renunciation of war as a means to show to the international community that it wasn't going to be a risk to the Pacific region like it was in World War II. More importantly, however, it continues, stating, "In order to accomplish the aim of the preceding paragraph, land, sea, and air forces, as well as other war potential, will never be maintained." What is important to pull from this effective demilitarization of Japan as a result? Obviously, Japan couldn't be expected to sit without any sort of defense, and this eventually led to the development of the security treaty between the US and Japan at the San Francisco Peace Conference in 1951. In addition to receiving the identity as a sovereign nation within this community of collective security, Japan additionally basically gave the US a monopoly over its national security, and an extension, international security in the East Pacific overall. The US could now put any land, air, or sea forces in Japan as it saw necessary, and they would even have a say over Japan allowing any other third-party military actions in Japan. Now, while this was a treaty made under the understanding that Japan would eventually build up its own defensive capabilities, as was begun by the implementation of the Japanese Self-Defense Force in 1954, the wording of the conditions as to when this treaty would expire are, to put it lightly, very vague. Let's just look at it to see what I mean. In Article 4 of the treaty, it reads, "This treaty shall expire whenever, in the opinion of the governments of the United States of America and Japan, there shall have come into force such United Nations arrangements or such alternative individual or collective security dispositions as will satisfactorily provide for the maintenance by the United Nations or otherwise of international peace and security in the Japan area. Now, that's a mouthful already, but in that wording lies the problem. I mean, let's be honest. Look what it says. In the opinion of the governments of the United States of America and Japan. With that vague wording, the US has basically a free ticket in this treaty, diplomatically, not free economically, to maintain military positioning and control over the entire Pacific region, basically until whenever it wants to. Without clearly defined conditions regarding the defensive capabilities of Japan, there's no way in hell a post-World War II global superpower like the US would give up an opportunity like that to essentially monopolize security in the Pacific. Now, glossing over a number of details regarding the US occupation of Japan, such as the difficulties surrounding the US giving Okinawa back to Japan, the backlashes in Japan surrounding fears of getting involved in the Vietnam War, we can basically boil all this information down to the US has maintained military bases in Japan, Okinawa especially, ever since the signing of this treaty. So now that we understand a bit of the context behind the USA's military position in Japan, what's the problem? Well, obviously there's the issue of US interventionism and globalized imperialism at large. Once again, my man Ron Paul said it best.
But when you talk about bases because we might need an offensive war, I consider that absolutely un-American.
That will of course be rebutted by any American hegemonic apologists who hold that the importance of global security in the Pacific supersedes any of those considerations. And while we could get into entire journals of the moral and economic aspects of the international US military position at large, I would like to examine the issues that are domestic to Japan, Okinawa especially. Look, there is no way to get around this. We spend a shitload of money on providing a de facto military defense for Japan, and it directly benefits their economy at a direct expense to us. Now listen, some may argue that this is a necessary cost in order to maintain our security posture in the Pacific. An idea that I call 100% bullshit on, given that there is the prevalent availability of US territories in the Pacific arena we can substitute with, such as Guam, that have more training capacity as well, which is something I'll get into later. Regardless, the fact of the matter is that we do spend a shitload of money to maintain this position. Now, a lot of detractors to that idea in recent years have come out of the woodworks, basically decrying that idea that we overspend in Japan, mostly because they just want to disagree with Trump in his statements in 2016 when he said that Japan needs to contribute more financially to the US military bases. Now, before you just write this off as a simple pro-Trump video, believe me, I have plenty of problems with Trump's foreign policy practices, but that's a whole different subject for a whole another time. But this is important to consider, because if you were just the average layman who heard Trump's comments and decided to Google, how much does US spend on bases in Japan, out of curiosity, and then clicked on the top United States Forces Japan link that leads you to Wikipedia, you would be directed to this figure, stating that Japan actually compensates a hefty 75% of the cost, a figure that's backed up by the source linked by the wiki page. This presented figure, however, is a bit misleading, and is really only presented to combat Trump's remarks rather than to make an actual argument regarding the economic implications of US military in Japan. As noted within the Japan Times, that 75% figure only relates to costs Japan covers in regards to base expenses, such as utilities, services, locally employed workers on the base, etc. It does not necessarily apply to the costs associated with the actual training of the fighting force in that base, such as training, gear, the cost of living allowance that increases when the yen to dollar ratio changes, etc., as well as how much the US has to spend on transporting troops off of Okinawa in order to conduct effective training, something I'll definitely be getting more into in the next section. All this information is further outlined in an extremely informative Wall Street Journal question and answer article by Yuka Koshino, an expert in Japanese security analysis and Japanese international relations. Now note, before we continue, please note that these figures have changed a little bit as this article was written in 2016 with the increase of Japanese defense spending, but nevertheless it is still incredibly helpful in examining the cost of US support. Now, like I said, to be fair, it's a bit more difficult to quantifiably measure those extra costs outside of the base directly, so we're going to go ahead and just give everybody the benefit of the doubt, and we're going to work off this 75% figure that's on Wikipedia. Now, given that that is such a huge chunk of the cost of the bases in Japan, what incentives drives Japan to provide that about $4 billion out of the $5.5 billion total, instead of simply putting that money towards their own military? Well, first, there's the problem with the Constitution, but there has been some push within the Japanese government to change that Constitution. So why don't they do that? Well, as shown by Koshino again in our article, it's still much less expensive to simply pay for the US military. And I quote, "The big financial benefit for Japan isn't having to pay the full cost of its own defense. Japan spends about $5 billion annually on defense, or about 1% of its gross domestic product. U.S. annual defense spending of $580 billion is about 3.5% of gross domestic product." Isa Muto and Yasuhiro Takeda, professors at National Defense Academy Japan, have estimated that Japan would have to spend an additional $4.2 trillion yen to procure vessels, aircraft carriers, and other new weapons to maintain the same level of defense without the alliance. Now look, I can't fault Japan for wanting to keep a good thing going. If you think about it, Japan is literally getting paid that extra $1 billion+ to not have to pay for its own national security. Now look, my own personal opinions about American imperialism via foreign bases aside, if that economic cost was worth it to maintain an effective fighting force in the Pacific, well, maybe it would be necessary to fork over that cash. But here's the kicker. We're paying a shitload of money to maintain a compromised military force in Japan. Now, this is where my analysis transitions from the quantitative examination of our economic situation to a bit more of a qualitative analysis based upon my experience as an artillery marine stationed at Okinawa. So I absolutely understand if you disagree with this next section, given that it subscribes to my own personal experiences. However, please understand that these experiences are additionally based upon a knowledgeable understanding of the training regulations in Okinawa, given that I was trapped inside the battalion training S3 office for a while I was in Okinawa. As it currently stands, you will not get good training stationed in Okinawa. I was even warned of this at artillery school by my instructor when I got my orders to Japan. As a small island that has a disproportionately large population, any sort of training outside of small arms fire, and I mean small arms fire, is simply out of the question. Hell, even for rifle qual, there are only 2 ranges on the many bases there. One in Camp Hansen, one in Camp Schwab. Want to work on some effective fire and maneuver with crew-served weapons? Can't do that. Sure, you can fire your 50 cal at the one range for crew-served weapons on Schwab, but you're basically just getting the experience of sitting down behind the weapon and pulling the trigger within the 2 stakes that represent your left and right lateral limits, and even that can result in mishaps. And when it comes to training in anything larger, such as an artillery in my case, wait, you simply can't. Simple as that. This is an additional complication that adds to the economic problem as well, by the way, as any artillery marines who are stationed or deployed to Okinawa, as any of you Okinawa warriors may know what I'm talking about when I say deployed, you can't actually conduct any live fire artillery training in Okinawa. The Marines have to pay more to ship your ass off the island to mainland Japan to either train at Camp Fuji or to Japanese Self-Defense Force base so you can actually have room to do a live shoot. Of course, it is much more of a logistical and costly endeavor than to just go for a quick week shoot in the backyards of 29 Palms, California, so that results in the Marines spending much less time in the field and much more time getting drunk in the barracks, which for the record isn't always a bad thing. But all jokes aside, this is incredibly detrimental to the combat readiness of the Marines who are stationed in Okinawa. Sure, the batteries that are deploying to Okinawa are provided a bit more of a regular training schedule with field ops conducted in all parts of the Pacific. But why couldn't the US simply move those base battalion units to US territories such as Guam that has a much lower population to square kilometer ratio than Okinawa? You could still make regular trips to Japan to conduct cross-military training exercises, just not have to pay for an effectively useless force in Okinawa that can't even train as regularly as it should. Hell, why not just invest those expenses into pushing those deployments out of Hawaii? all of which, by the way, were solutions being examined by the 3rd Marine Division in 2014-2015 when I was still stationed in Okinawa, and Japan has even pledged to contribute funds to assist in moving approximately 4,000 troops to Guam in 2016. Now, once again, when you look at the intentions behind all of this, it all comes back to the hegemonic position of the US and the economics in Japan. Japan doesn't want to have to pay full price for their defensive budget, a process that would additionally require the transformation of their post-World War II constitution, and the US doesn't want to have to give up that hegemonic power it holds in the Pacific, even if it literally means paying for a less effective fighting force. Lastly, let's just say that the US military has a bit of a rough history regarding military-civilian relations in Japan, especially in Okinawa. Now, to be fair, that's a bit of an arguable point given that these incidents really only make headlines because it's a foreign military member of Japan, but still, given the earlier discussed points, why are we even wasting our time investing money and time into risking these headlines that come along with the troops in Japan? Look, I'm not saying that there is no merit to maintain a good cross-training relationship with the Japanese military, nor am I saying that having a strategic position in the Pacific does not have its merits. I am, however, saying that the economic and tactical readiness costs that come with us maintaining this position in Japan is simply not worth the support it provides to our hegemonic position in the international community. Not to mention, as my man Ron Paul put it best, we shouldn't even have this imperialistic hegemonic position to begin with,
because that's the way dictators work.
like I said, different time, different subject. I love living in Japan for 2 years as an artillery marine. The memories made of that little island are priceless to me, but we have to be honest and ask ourselves if the costs of stationing troops in Japan are worth the benefits. Given the bloated military budget we maintain already, and which seems to be growing year by year, I would argue that these costs simply aren't worth it. If you made it to the end of this video, I really appreciate you, even if you were just here to laugh at my horrible gameplay and didn't really care what I was talking about. Hell, if that's the case and you just like to watch something funny instead of listening to a boring subject, you probably have more in common with a Japanese politician than you might think. Anyways, this is the first video I've ever made, and I'd love to get any feedback you may have. Drop anything on your mind in the comments below, and if it gets enough attention, maybe I'll turn this into some sort of bad gaming with political commentary. Thanks!